Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so excited to look out at our audience here at Friendly House. You're here at the Humanists of Greater Portland Sunday morning meeting, and we have a crowd very similar in size here to pre-COVID. So it's not often that we have a speaker who's been nominated 8 times for a Nobel Peace Prize. So that, and I want to also take a minute to thank our AV team. You really scrambled this morning to have overflow available if we need it, and just to manage our larger crowd. So thank you so much all for being here. You are at the Humanists of Greater Portland Sunday morning meeting, and to a quick definition of humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It affirms the dignity of all humans. Humanists believe that this is the only life of which we are certain. And because of that belief, we attempt to live the best life we can envision for ourselves. We have a reader. Laurent, are you there?
Okay, the reading this morning is about time and relativity. According to Einstein, the answer to the question, does time really slow down just because you're moving fast, is yes, time does slow down. If a person goes on a high-speed trip to a distant star and returns to Earth, then time slows down for that person. Imagine identical twins, one of whom goes on a one-way trip, turns around, and then comes back. Upon return, the traveler sees that she is younger than her sister, who remained at home. Keep in mind, they are identical twins. They are supposed to be the same age. Suppose that 2 years pass for the traveler on the spaceship, then the theory of relativity tells us that 40 years can pass on Earth while only 2 years pass for the traveler. How do we understand this? Has the traveler found a way to make time slow down? Has she found a way to prolong her life? No. In fact, no one's life gets extended by taking high-speed, far-out trips. Nevertheless, she does see that she has aged only 2 years while 40 years have passed on Earth. At the beginning of the trip, the twins are 30 years old, let's say. Then the traveler twin returns at age 32, but the stay-at-home twin is now age 70. What sense does the traveler make of this? Well, for her, 2 years have passed, and she will think that she has traveled 40 years into the future. Is travel into the future really possible? Well, actually, we all do travel into the future. The fact is that the rate at which the future comes about changes for us when we take far-out high-speed trips. At any rate, time does go from past to future. We know that much. So how can we understand what is going on here? The answer is that we need to abandon the notion of absolute time. This is what Einstein did early in the 20th century. The overthrow of absolute time is the foundation of the theory of relativity. How did Einstein do it? Einstein saw that if the speed of light is an absolute limit, then there can be no such thing as over there right now. This idea is worth repeating. No such thing as over there right now. Absolute simultaneity does not exist. If you look at the sun, you're not seeing the sun right now. You're seeing the sun, I don't know, about 9 minutes ago. And if you look at the moon, you're seeing what you're seeing is 1 second ago. So it turns out that time really is something else.
Thank you, Lauren. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to take just a moment to thank Amanda Fuller for bringing, I said it right, to bring our speaker here today, your colleague. Thank you so much for all you did to also get the word out. Thank you. Okay. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. This gentleman, Dr. Steinar Bryn, has spoken here in the past, and probably maybe 15, 20 years ago. I'm not sure how long for certain. But when I heard him, it significantly changed my life. There was a perspective that I did not have before. And that is, when you're with strangers or people that you be in conflict with or very different from, or joining another group, you're supposed to feel anxious. It's the normal feeling, and that there's, and that when you do this, it's something brave to do. And it's really affected my life since that meeting. And so I'm so glad to welcome him, Dr. Steinar Bryn, back here this morning. Dr. Steinar Bryn earned his Ph.D. at the University of Minnesota in 1993. Since 1995, Dr. Bryn has been involved full-time in dialogue work with people in extreme conflict. He has facilitated more than 250 dialogue meetings. These meetings have lasted a weekend to up to 3 months. Dr. Bryn has been nominated 8 times for his work for a Nobel Peace Prize. He's accompanied today by his wife, Dr. Western Balkans. Dr. Bryn holds a Ph.D. and a medical degree. Her work focuses on the neurological, genetic, and biological causes of autism. Thank you, Dr. Bryn, for accompanying your husband here today. And now, please help me welcome Dr. Steinar Bryn to the podium.
Thank you. We were discussing when was the last time I was here, and I think in 2011. But I also think that I was here once earlier, 2004, 2007. But our memories are not as good as they used to be. I'm very glad to be here, and I will talk about some important lessons that I have learned, but I will also relate it to the current dramatic conflict which goes on in Ukraine. And I will explain why I am particularly concerned about this conflict. I grew up in Norway, and when I was young, I wrote a high school paper about the founder of the Nansen Academy in Lillehammer. And I had a very special drive. I wanted to meet people that inspired me. And maybe in my youth, the one that inspired me the most was Viktor Frankl. He's a psychiatrist from Vienna. And he wrote several books about meaning. What is the meaning of life? But one sentence stood out. Actually, 2 sentences. Whatever situation you're in, you can make the best out of it. But secondly, if you treat people like they are, you make them worse. If you treat them according to their potential, you can help them reach it. I came as a student to the Nansen Academy. It's named after Fridtjof Nansen, probably the greatest humanitarian in Norway in the 20th century. But he was maybe the last Renaissance man, because he had so many different human qualities. He was a great artist. He was a polar researcher. He was also into neuroscience. He was one of the first to suggest that our brain cells are communicating with each other. He was a polar explorer. He spent 2 years trying to reach the North Pole. He didn't succeed. And many of his dreams he never fulfilled, but he always tried to reach them. He became the first High Commissioner for Refugees. And after World War I, he was so concerned about how to provide travel documents, because hundreds of thousands of people couldn't travel back home. They didn't have a travel document. So he said, give me authority to issue a passport. And people said, you're crazy. Individuals cannot do that. States do that. Well, give me a chance. And he traveled around and got authority from 52 different states. And back then, it wasn't that much more states, around. 350,000 people from Armenia got the Nansen passport. People like Igor Stravinsky, Sergei Rachmaninov, and the dancer Olga Pavlova, they all got the Nansen passport. Actually, also another man we all know, Aristoteles Onassis. And he got the Nobel Peace Prize for this work in 1922. And when he got the Peace Prize, he gave a speech, and the speech was called No More War. I have this introduction because when I talk about Ukraine, that's where I'm coming from. I'm coming from the position of no more war. And the reason he was so against war was he saw the brutality after World War I. And in all his speeches, articles, he said, this must never, ever happen again. And we know that it happened again, and almost equally brutal with World War II. He gave half the money to Ukraine and Russia. So working at the Nansen Academy, little bit set me up for being engaged in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. But before then, back in 1974, I was biking home. I biked past a hitchhiker. He's standing in a very awkward, stupid spot. And I turn around, I go back, and I say, wait a minute, you should move, further up the road. And we start to talk. He's hungry, he's tired, and he's an American. So I invite him home, and he stays for a week. I couldn't get rid of him. And every night we are fighting because I said, you Americans, you Americans, you Americans, you do this, you do that. And I remember because I said, you Americans, you always go driving when you go shopping. And he said, well, Steinar, in my hometown, we sold more bicycles than cars last year. Oh, you're lying. He came from Eugene, Oregon, but I had no understanding of what Eugene, Oregon meant. Then probably on the fourth or fifth night, he says, how come you know so much about us Americans? That question made me feel stupid. Well, I've been watching TV, I've been reading the news, and I've seen some films. Come on, Steinar, you have never been there? No, I haven't. And he really challenged me. And in that moment, I decided I will go and check this place out. I had no friends, no family. So I went down to the American embassy and I started looking at catalogs in the library. And there is one catalog that stands out. University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. It sounded like Hawaii. I took my bachelor in Green Bay in modernization processes. And I also took my master at University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. And I'm very happy and glad to see my advisor for my master sitting here today, David Galati. I think that he followed Viktor Frankl's advice when he treated me, not like I was. He treated me according to my potential. Because he very often said, come on, Steinar, you can do a little bit better. Come on, Steinar, you can do a little bit better. And when you're young, you're very influenced by what you read, what other people say. And David kept saying, but what do you think about this, Steinar? What do you think about this? And that was kind of a basis for my master thesis called Toward a Personalistic Politics. Even in philosophy, it's not only important what Aristotle, Plato, Descartes are thinking, but what do you think about it? So thank you, David. I have very good memories from those years. Good. In coming back to Norway, I was confused because my image of Norway and America growing up was Norway was very traditional. My image was shaped by the church, by the school, by politicians, and my family. And I was always told that America, I say America because America was a little bit more than those 50 states. America was much more modern. I live in a traditional Norway. I come to this modern America. There was a professor also at Green Bay. He said, Steinar, you have to use this opportunity to travel around, to see, to learn. And you're spending too much time in the library. So when I started to travel, that was Ia Corner. And when I started to travel, the first thing that little bit shocked me was United States was so old. I came through towns in the Midwest, and it was the main street from the turn of the century, not this turn, but the previous one. While in Norway was very modernized after World War II. And traveling around, I also met a lot of people protesting the Vietnam War, which was very in our minds at that time. And when I came back, I was confused. And one of my friends said, Steinar cannot see it objectively anymore. He has been there. That was the background why I enrolled in American Studies. I wanted to find out what this is all about. And it was 4 years. And I wrote my dissertation about the Americanization of Norwegian culture. And again, the purpose of this long introduction is to illustrate that I started out by thinking rather dichotomical about Norway and the United States. There were two complete different things. When I was doing my dissertation, I started more to see it as a continuity. Back to modernization processes, we are all modernizing. Some countries are 20 years behind, 30 years behind, but technology, electronic development, digital development is all pushing us in the same direction. So it's only a question of time before we all have the same conditions and the same possibilities for quality of life. This fit well in the 20th century. In the 20th century, modernization was even what development aid was about. But in the 21st century, we have kind of realized that there are people seriously defending tradition. Tradition is not something that we need to move away from. And one way to understand the whole war in Afghanistan can be to look closer at that conflict between Kabul becoming very fast a modern city, while the traditional environment didn't follow that process. Even the rockets being fired from Gaza toward Tel Aviv is fired from a very traditional area toward a very ultra-modern city, Tel Aviv. And in Europe, we do see a lot of polarization, like you experience here in the United States. And it's a revival of nationalism. But when you look closer, it's actually traditionalism disguised as nationalism. And this conflict between tradition and modernity is also helping me to understand some of the polarization going on in United States. I'm now based in Decorah, Iowa. I feel illoyal when I'm telling you the truth about Iowa. Iowa is idiots out walking around. Don't tell anybody in Iowa. I am at Luther College, and I'm very impressed by the Lutheran colleges. They have committed teachers, they're dedicated, and they emphasize international travel, international learning. But of course, there are also people that never have left Iowa. So you have tradition, modernity, and the challenge for any democracy is how will we live with and tackle this tension. But this was even strengthened when I started the work with Dialog. In 1994, we host the Winter Olympics in my hometown, Lillehammer. It's kind of a fantastic event because first of all, we thought we never would get it. We just applied. And we applied because it gave us a lot of attention. It increased the tourist attraction. So Lillehammer got a name. We applied for the Olympics in '92. Yeah, let's apply again. It's fun. So we applied, and then we got it. Decision is Lillehammer, and we didn't know how to deal with it. We spent 2 years like idiots walking around because how can we? I mean, this is too much for us. But then we got started and we did host very good Olympics. That connected us with Sarajevo that had the Olympics in 1984. But the war is going on in Sarajevo. So the question is there anything we can do? The Nansen Academy is like it's actually called the Norwegian Humanistic Academy. The Nansen Academy is like a small college. You have students, you have dormitory, you have dining facilities, you have social and cultural events. People live together in a very intimate way. But we only have 70 students, not 700, not 7,000. And we freed up 16 beds. They were paid for by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we invited 16 potential leaders from the Western Balkans to come and sit for 3 months and deal with the issue of why the breakup of Yugoslavia were so bloody. And is it possible to rebuild trust, communication after what happened? Can we forgive? Can we move on? Can we rebuild our relationships? 3 months is quite some time. I sometimes have friends that come and tell me, Steinar, we're giving up. We're going to have a divorce. And I say, wow, that's a little bit surprising. Have you tried a long conversation? What do you mean? Long conversation? 3 months? 3 months? Can't talk to him for 3 hours. So probably in 2023, it would be very difficult to gather people for 3 months. But in 95, it was possible. The war was still going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina when we started. When you live intimately like this, the first difficulty, and maybe even the biggest difficulty, was to get people to come. So how do you recruit? How do you get people that are opposing each other to actually enter into a common room? That is a challenge. And I go around now in the classes at Luther College in Decorah, I talk about dialogue, and people often say, oh, but we tried, we had this dialogue meeting 8 o'clock, and by 10 o'clock it was over, and it didn't work. Well, of course it didn't work, because the amount of preparation needed before a dialogue meeting, you might have to spend months, sometimes even years, to convince people to participate. When they come into the room, my job was much, much easier. Actually, probably as easy as any other job in a room, like a teacher, because people had a wish to talk, they had a wish to confront each other. Why did you do that? How do you feel about it? Do you want to say you're sorry? Where were you 12th of April, 1999? Where were you? What did you do? Can you accept this in the future? Etc. And in the beginning, people from ex-Yugoslavia came with very powerful ethnic clothes. So you could see who were Serbs, who were Macedonians, who were Albanians, who were Croats, who were Bosniaks. They would often even sit and eat together on tables. But we had a basketball court, and people started to shoot the basket. Wow, I hate you as a Serb, but you sure can shoot the basket. We could go to a jazz concert. Wow, you like jazz too? I do too. We could even go cross-country skiing. Wow. So people discovered the multiple dimensions of each other's personality, and some would connect. And over time, actually some of the more modern people would connect, that, let's say, supported countries in the Western Balkans to join European Union. Other people, more traditional, would also connect across ethnic divides. The first question, the first conversation, very often dealt with what have made you who you are? What is it that shaped the way you think? And you can even do that in your head yourself. What shaped the way you think about America? Was it a special teacher in school? Was it a special neighbor? Somebody in your family? Was it some special books you read or films you saw? Or was it experiences? Very often it is specific experiences. When I was 6 years old, this happened, when, etc. But when people are telling that story, it becomes possible to somehow think that, wow, if I had been you, I would have been thinking and acting like you. Now that I understand the process you have gone through to reach that position, it makes more sense what you do. And this is kind of interesting because are conflicts that coincidental that it depends on where you're born and what family you're raised in? It defines the language you learn. It defines very often who the enemy is. It's a difference between being born in Idaho and being born in Oregon. And I was just in Moorhead, that's in Minnesota, and right across the border is Fargo in North Dakota, and there is a Red River between. And when I talked about conflicts in Western Balkans, they said, well, it's almost a little bit like here, the conflict between Fargo and Moorhead with the river in between. So if a Serb born in a Serbian village had been an Albanian born in an Albanian village, if a Palestinian born in a Palestinian village had been born in an Israeli village, the enemy would have been different. In one dialogue meeting, I have a soldier from the Serbian army and a soldier from the Kosovo Liberation Army, Albanian, and they realized they were in a battle together, trying to kill each other. And they started a little bit joking about it. You know, I could have killed you, man. I'm glad I didn't. And we formulated the first Nansen communication law. Always have a cup of coffee with those you're going to kill, but have the cup of coffee first. It might actually change your mind. And we hear that we heard it from Erik Maria Remarque into Neues from the Western Front. We hear it now from the Eastern Front. In the moment people are killing, they realize they're killing maybe somebody like themselves. That man is also 20 years old. That man looks kind of as lost as I do. I have the gun, I have the upper hand. And in Erik Maria Remarque's book, the character says, I cannot kill him. And the person beside says, come on, you have to kill him. That is what we do in war. So the next conversation would very often be how conflict affected you. And again, people start to tell stories that have similarities. Because when you are in a deep conflict, you might have lost a family member, you might have lost your home, you might have lost your country, you might be a refugee. And through telling that story, they somehow realize it's not as if you are the winner and we are the losers. We are all losing much too much in a conflict. And this is kind of a human tendency that when we really are fighting our enemy, we want them to lose so much that we can carry a loss as long as they lose more than us. Lose-lose is preferable to win-win. And of course, win-lose would be the best, but very often that does not happen. What happens is lose-lose. Over the years, there were probably close to 3,000 people that came from Western Balkans and have been in our living room. And I started to think about how the place affects people. So what does it mean to walk the main street? We have one thing we always do with every group. We go to the top of the ski jump, the Olympic ski jump, and we walk down 1,000 steps. And then people says, well, don't talk so much about this ski jump, Steinar. They might think you're not serious. But going down 10,000 steps together does something to people. Walking the main street does something to people. Even our veranda in our home is built with a certain reconciliation purpose. This is where you drink and this is where you dance. And twice we had to remodel our floor because it was too worn out. Timing the music, timing the dancing is very essential. But you cannot bring people together only by conversation and dialogue. You have to use social, cultural, physical activities. So it's kind of around the clock. In the beginning, there was not much dialogue. It was debate. People had their positions, they had their narratives, and they were arguing their position, trying to convince the others that I'm right, you're wrong, my truth is the truth, your truth is a lie. And over time, when the respect was building up, they started to be more curious to hear what the others told. Because maybe my grandfather didn't tell me everything. Maybe my professor, maybe my journalist didn't tell me everything. And through listening, they somehow developed a more holistic picture. And some of these people were very energized to go home and start this kind of dialogue work back home. Dialogue, the essence of dialogue is to focus more on understanding the other. It is not to reach an agreement. To reach an agreement, you must have mediation, you must have negotiation, you might even need mathematics. Dialogue is the kind of first component, because if you don't understand what the conflict is about, how can you reach a conclusion? To use an example from Ukraine, when people in Donbas revolted in 2014, it was based on being neglected by Kiev, being misunderstood, being absolutely segregated from the center of power, like a lot of other people feel in the world. People in Catalonia in Spain do not feel recognized by Madrid. People in Pristina in Kosovo did not feel recognized by Belgrade. And even the Sami up north in Norway do not feel recognized by Oslo, the capital. So when we talk about national interests, they don't feel included. These are not our interests. And I am in very good contact with the High Commissioner for National Minorities in Europe between 2007 and 2013. And he says, I never met such hate as I did in Donetsk against Kiev. And he was the one negotiating with Milosevic, trying to avoid the bombing in 1999. But still, the hate in Donetsk. Kiev are certain that Russia is behind. This is not something that people in Donbas wants. It's a little bit like saying NATO, when they bombed Serbia and Kosovo, they initiated it. They were behind the revolt. Instead of realizing Albanians in Kosovo were neglected by Belgrade, they wanted to break away and establish their own republic. And the United States supported that through the bombing very strongly. But the United States did not come up with the idea. So here, when Kiev attacks, they are not attacking Ukrainian living in Donbas. They're attacking Moscow because they are convinced Moscow is behind. Then Moscow is sure United States is behind Kiev. So they retaliate equally strong. So this is an example of how we have three layers of war on top of each other. And if you ask people, what are you fighting about? You would actually get different answer depending on who you're talking to. So the whole notion of dialogue is very much to understand why we are breaking up if we are a married couple, why we have this conflict in the family. And this is also a kind of a more interesting way to understand the word. What are people fighting about in that country? What are people fighting about in that family, instead of only what they agree upon? So dialogue is a tool, but it's also an attitude toward life. And the first question we have to ask is, why isn't dialogue more popular? Why isn't dialogue embraced around the world. Because if we want to have a peaceful world, it would be so much easier if we could understand each other. A democracy would be so much more efficient if we understood the people living together. And there are many reasons why dialogue is not appreciated. One diplomat said to me, Steinar, you must know the problem with dialogue, it's too womanish. It's what women do. Another, also diplomat in the Norwegian embassy, said, Steinar, dialogue, we think about that as cozy talk. And my experience is the opposite. It can be very brutal conversation about the essential things of the conflict. One way of communicating that I always use is simply allowing the two parties to ask each other questions. So they formulate the questions one day, they think about how they will answer, and the next day we come together and we try to answer the questions. Normally I say ask 10 questions each, because formulating the questions is a process that really can help your own understanding of things. And I have never in any dialogue seminar been able to go through all 10 questions, because we start to talk so long about the first one. Just try this at home, but be a little bit careful. In several of the people that participated, when they came back home, they were not understood. They didn't change their political opinion, they didn't change their goals, but they changed the perception of the enemy. The enemy got a human face. In Norwegian mythology, many trolls have only one eye in the middle of the forehead. And before Facebook, people actually would believe that, because you heard it over and over again. When you hear things over and over again, you start to think this is true. And if you lived on the other island, you were more primitive, you were less educated, and you had only one eye in the forehead. The reason why we got such good support from the foreign ministry was that during the Olympics, we had a day gathering between Israelis and Palestinians, and that one day made a difference, because they discovered they have human faces. They thought the others have only one eye in the middle of the forehead. So dialogue work is not as difficult as we think. But when it comes to the arguments against dialogue, people say, oh, dialogue, I know what they're going to say anyway. It's a waste of time. Or people say, I don't want to listen to them. And in a conflict, and that has also been my greatest challenge, you don't want to talk because it's a way of showing respect. I invited Palestinian Israeli filmmakers to come to Lillehammer, and the Palestinians, they said, no, we don't want that. That is to show them an honor and respect they do not deserve. These were women, female documentary filmmakers. And I said, well, don't you want to show the film you have made about your reality? Well, yeah, maybe. Do you think that Israeli politicians, teachers tell the truth? No, they don't. Well, I'm inviting you to come and show your film to them. And they said, wow, is that dialogue? Yes, dialogue is to make yourself visible so the others see you, but also allowing them to show their films to you. And they said, well, wow, we thought dialogue was what was going on at Camp David. No, that's political communication in the other end of the spectrum. And they said, okay, we'll come, but can you promise us one thing? Don't call it dialogue. Because dialogue had lost the value. The word itself was slightly destroyed. And people often say, let's solve it with dialogue. You can't solve anything with dialogue, but you can increase your understanding through dialogue. And there is one last argument that is kind of tough, because some people believe they have found the truth. That doesn't include the humanists. Sorry. So to engage in dialogue, with others, it's some kind of a relativization of truth. And to talk about comparative truths is a little bit undermining the kind of basis of truth being somewhat objective. We can find the truth about many things. And the way that I deal with that is that we have to start with what people believe is true. Because if you believe I killed your father, you will hate me. And I know I didn't. But as long as you believe that, that's the starting point of our relationship. In Kosovo, there is a very famous event in 1991. Albanians accused the Serbs for poisoning children in the schools. And if you get off the plane today in Kosovo and you ask somebody in the street, is it true that Serbs poisoned Albanians in the schools in 91? And they say, yes, of course, I was there myself. You talked to an Albanian. It's a collective truth. And if the person says, are you crazy? Poisoning kids in the school? Of course, it never happened. It was just a performance for the world to get sympathy. So we're talking about this in very many of these dialogue groups. And at one moment, one Serb says, wow, you really believe we poisoned you? Now I understand why you hate us. Because his whole life, he was sure they had performed. And when you perform, you perform. So they would know it was a lie. And he lost respect for them. But when he realizes they actually believe it, then some of the conflict makes more sense. This last thought, about the truth. In dialogue context, some people say, agree to disagree. And I don't agree with that. I do believe there are some truths that we can find together as a dialogical truth. But there must be enough respect, there must be enough trust between the people, because if you don't have that trust and respect, it will be just a debate, ping pong, back and forth, and finding the truth is less important than convincing the others that you are right. So we've had, in some situations, very different narratives about what happened in that place at that time. But when the trust and confidence have been built up, we can start to explore this together. So my most important lesson learned is that when people do spend a lot of time in dialogue, when they spend a lot of time trying to understand where the others are coming from, they are humanized. They are becoming less difficult to kill. Because to kill somebody else, you somehow must dehumanize that person. And you get that second thought in the moment you fire, because in a glimpse, you see that face, you see the scare, the fright, and you have that feeling, maybe it's a human being like me. Maybe I see a mirror. Maybe I am killing somebody like myself. In Ukraine, in 2014, the war starts in Donbass, and it's a very brutal war. 14,000 people are killed between 2014 and 2022. But in Europe and in the United States, most countries didn't get involved. There were sanctions, but the sanctions were not that strong and not that effective. And people were starting a little bit to accept the reality of Crimea being controlled by Russia and parts of Donbass being mainly pro-Russian. And that was the condition up until February, 24th of February, 2022. 24th of February, 2023, both Putin and Biden got good opportunity to explain to their own people what this war is about. So Biden says very clearly, We are helping the Ukrainian people to defend themselves against the brutal aggressor. The invasion of Ukraine is not only breaking international law, it's criminal. And they have a right to defend themselves, but they don't have the weapons, they don't have the money, they don't have the military skills. So we will help and support as much as we can because they have been attacked and they have the right to defend themselves. In addition, they're fighting for democracy, human rights, our values. They're actually fighting a war for us. Also, Norwegian politicians say that. They are fighting for us. We have to support them. We cannot let them do this fight alone. Putin spends most of his propaganda on explaining this is another attack from the West. We had Karl XII in 1709. We had Napoleon in 1812. We had Hitler in the 1940s, and now they're coming again. And all the weapons, all the tanks, everything we are giving is somehow evidence that he is using. Here they're coming again. And to fight for Russia against a decadent West is what Russia is about and has been about the last hundreds of years. And within the Russian nation building, there is a strong willingness to sacrifice human lives. In World War II, there are numbers up to 27 million dying in World War II. But it was a necessary sacrifice to resist Nazism and fascism from Europe, from Germany and Italy particularly. Is this what the war is about? I'll come back to that because that's a very important question. Is the war about, because in this way of talking, both Biden and Putin are fighting a defensive war. 100,000s of soldiers are killed when they're trying to defend. And I'm also questioning, because I cannot go into the mind of Putin, but I can look at my country. Norway have the head of NATO. So it's not as if I'm talking about somebody else. Norway is a very clear partner in this. Jens Stoltenberg is a person we all know in Norway. We had a saying, you can always call Jens. Now you can't anymore. And Jonas Gahr Støre, the Prime Minister of Norway, he was very close to Lavrov in Russia. Because in the northern part of Norway, we have borders to Russia, and we have the Barents Sea. And there is a lot of bilateral agreements between Norway and Russia that are very wisely developed. And these are not, let's say, internationally recognized, because it's not the business of Switzerland. This is the business of Russia and Norway up north, how we divide, how we help each other in emergency, and so forth. So when the war started, everybody were challenged to give weapons. And Norway said, wait a minute, we have a communication channel. If everybody else is giving weapons, maybe we should keep that communication channel open. But after just a few days, we also decided, because everybody else, then we have to be like everybody else. So now there is no communication channel between Russia and Western Europe. I was picking up in the bookstore just a few days ago, William Burns, the current head of CIA, has written a book called The Back Channel. And he's talking about how the cancellation culture has reached all the way into diplomacy. There are some countries, there are some leaders we don't talk to. Those who really try to understand what the war is about in Norway, they conclude it's about the Black Sea. So to control the Black Sea is so important, not only for military reasons, but also for trade, for cooperation, for economic growth. And both Russia and Ukraine have a lot of corn, fertilizers, minerals, and is important for providing food to the world. Not so much artificial intelligence, but basic things that people need all over the world. Crimea is an island in the Black Sea. It's kind of a peninsula, but it functions as an island. On Crimea, there is a military base, a Russian military base. That was established in 1783. The first 11 Russian ships came to Sebastopol, and that is one of two large military bases Russia has. United States has probably 700 around the world. So as long as Crimea, Russia, Ukraine were in the same bubble, this was not a problem. So in 1991, when Russia and Ukraine became independent, Kravchuk, the president of Ukraine, is sure that with the new borders, Crimea will be part of Russia. He writes about that in his memoirs, published in 2014. And why didn't it happen? Well, a lot of people suggest Yeltsin was too drunk that night. But it wasn't that important. In 1994, Ukraine gave all the nuclear weapons to Russia. They wouldn't have done that if they didn't trust them. And Russia promised to never invade and to never change the borders of Ukraine. And just to make that clear, my personal position is that we have to stop to change borders. Because if you change them one place, then it has an effect. So don't change the border between Oregon and Idaho. Keep the borders you have, because that's the only way you can keep all the other borders as well. This is Putin is using because the United States was so actively supporting the breakaway republic of Serbia, Kosovo, which by the constitution had no right to break away, while they're also spending trillions on supporting Ukraine to keep Donbas in Ukraine. And Crimea was Russian until 1954. Khrushchev is from Donetsk in Ukraine. And he, in 1954, gives Crimea back to Ukraine. So from 54 until 2014, legally, juridically, Crimea is a part of Ukrainian territory, but it's kind of Russian in everyday life. And even Ukrainians traveling to Crimea said it was like going to another country, because Russians treated Ukrainians all the time as little Russians. So to go to Crimea wasn't a very pleasant experience for people from Ukraine. Throughout, from Gorbachev throughout the 90s into the 2000s, Ukraine do not want to become member of NATO. So there is no majority in Ukraine. But with Maidan in 2014, somehow things start to change. And it's very clear that from Maidan and onwards, there is a majority in Ukraine that will now want to join NATO. And that's when Russia acts, because Ukraine had always been this buffer zone and they felt threatened. But there are very well-informed people who say the annexation of Crimea is mainly about protecting the military base. So if NATO takes control of Ukraine, they will also take control of that military base, the Black Sea Fleet. So when Ukraine is annexed, or when Crimea is annexed, it's a way from Putin to somehow create border conflict that is so strong that in the statutes of NATO, it says, we cannot accept new members that have border conflicts with the neighboring states. So annexing Crimea is a mean toward another end. These things are very complex, and these things are very, very difficult to get to. But to somehow conclude, and then I want to open up for a discussion, is that currently in Ukraine, it's very difficult to even talk about dialogue. Since 2014, I have visited Ukraine around 20 times. I've traveled around, used my experience from the Western Balkans, and talked about every possible way we can use to avoid the war. That was not successful, which is an evidence that people working for dialogue are not in power and are not majority in the world, rather the opposite. And I am right now thinking a lot about the reconciliation process, because Russia and Ukraine will be neighbors forever. And when you have these kind of wars, do they foster democracy? Because very often what happens is they foster nationalism. So the winner of the war, whether it's Croatia, Serbia, the Western world, the losers have a tough time. It was very hard to be German in Denmark, in Norway, after World War II. It's been said that we, the winners of the war, we killed around 2 million Germans after the war. And what happened in Denmark was brutal, although those Germans were citizens of Denmark. In Norway, we discussed sending 3,000 children to Australia because they had German blood. And it won't be easy to run a Russian restaurant in Kiev after this. In all I read in Norwegian newspapers, European newspapers, American newspapers, we keep repeating, this is a just war. It's a legitimate war. We have to keep supporting stronger and stronger weapons. But I'm wondering, are we escalating the war? Because when we start to use stronger weapons, response is stronger weapons. And this, if United States supports an attack to reconquer Crimea, Putin will never let Crimea go, and he might be forced to use nuclear. And that will mean Armageddon. And I think we should ask the people living in Crimea, what do they think? Would they want a war that destroys the territory? Or would they want to wake up in the morning, have their coffee, go out and harvest the field, send their kids to school, and live a normal life? And I'm 100% convinced that is what they want. It's less important if they're part of this or part of that. So why in this situation, where the consequences of the war is now so catastrophical that it doesn't really matter anymore why they started? It's a little bit like two boys in middle school. They start to fight for an obvious reason, and maybe one has a right to fight. But after a while, they keep fighting because they're fighting. And the people standing around cheering, come on, come on, come on. Here is a baseball bat, take it. Then there is the dynamic of the war that causes a lot of actions. It was not as if Putin was planning to destroy the infrastructure, destroy the cities. He actually thought it would be a very quick thing. He thought that somehow it would be more appreciated by the Ukrainian people. He thought Europe would not get involved the way we did. And he thought the United States was busy with China and Taiwan and other things. So the consequences are now so brutal. But the problem for Biden, the problem for Zelensky, the problem for Putin is that if they now sit down and negotiate, the negotiation result will be very similar to the situation before the war. And that they cannot justify. How can Putin justify the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of soldiers if nothing was gained? How can Zelensky justify sending young Ukrainians to the front line? I have personal friends in Kiev. They tell me, Steinar, this has gone out of control, but we cannot protest. It's taboo. We cannot have an anti-war demonstrations in the streets of Kiev. And it's easier for the top three leaders to justify the war than it is to justify a serious attempt to make peace. And that is the biggest challenge for dialogue in the modern world. It is too weak up against this strong military power and what that does to the political leaders. Thank you.
Dr. Bryn, thank you so much. That was enlightening and much appreciated. We'll be taking questions from Friendly House. Okay, that's you, my friend and husband.
Okay. America has I'm worried about Americans becoming a divided nation now. We're trying to get dialogue going here just among people in our community, and we're having a real hard time with it. How do you represent all interests, not just two sides?
I think that's a very relevant challenge, because in this war, you have European Union, you have NATO, you have United States, three extremely powerful actors. So when we come to the negotiation, their needs will be given a higher priority, and that's security for Europe, that's stability for Europe, that's economic growth for Europe. And the United States' great interest would be to somehow let Europe take care of their own business, so we can somehow lower our involvement and be more focused on Eastern, other places. So Ukraine might very well be far down on the list, like the blacks in the US. But I studied this country, and I talked highly about my years in Green Bay, and I would never have been investing so much time here unless I really felt that there is something also in that American history which is inclusive. There is a certain dream of one society for all. It's just much more difficult than we thought. And it means and this is what we're doing in the Western Balkans. We are redoing educational systems. We are rewriting curriculum. We are retraining teachers to teach for one society for all. But there are people in the United States that also believe in one society for all. And all of us in all countries have to unite.
Mary has a question from Friendly House.
How do you see the recent announcement by Putin that he's moving nuclear weapons into Belarus?
To be honest, it scares me, because nobody put the brakes on. In the United States, you had intelligence information that Russia was planning invasion by mid-2021. So you could read even in Washington Post in the fall, clear statements about this. But nobody's putting the brakes on. And everything we do are signs of escalation. So what Putin is now informed about is that the United States is preparing an attack of Crimea, and he is preparing to defend Crimea. And nobody's asking the people living there if they want to be reconquered. I'm deeply worried about what Putin can be capable of doing. And I'm also deeply worried by the fact that we are pushing him and pushing him and pushing him in that direction.
We have a question from our Zoom audience. Renga, can you come in and ask your question?
Yeah. Yeah, you talked about this escalation of the war. See, during the Iraq war, there was no such thing happen. Now, what do you think of this type of escalation? It may add, even if you have some amount of agreement in terms of war, but some of these external things are going to exacerbate the things. So that is another form of escalation. What do you think about it?
Yes, I'm worried about that. I don't see what they hope to accomplish, because if, let's say, the long-term goal is to support democratic forces, to support those people in Russia that wants to make a change, they have to be included. So to have sanctions work, you need to build up a very strong anti-feeling toward a people. So it's not only Putin, it's the Russians. Probably any Russian leader would fight for the Black Sea. It's not Putin that is fighting for the Black Sea. It's Russia that's fighting for the Black Sea. But it's not all Russians that want this war. And from my point of view, being a Norwegian, now we are even winning everything because the Russians are not allowed to participate. And it's building up a very strong negativity toward everything Russian. So even when the war stops, it's going to take a long time to rebuild the understanding of Russians as equal. But if we want to support change in Russia, of course, we have to invite them to universities in Oslo, to universities in, Berkeley and Portland and even Tacoma. So yes, to boycott is not bringing us closer to peace. Maybe the opposite.
We have a question also on Zoom from Hank Robb. Hank, can you come in, please?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I want to switch direction a little bit and go back to the discussion of dialogue. My experience is that it is often the case that people believe if they were properly understood, they would be agreed with. And it is difficult to get over the gap of making understanding and agreement two different things. Do you have that experience in working in dialogue?
Sure.
Yes, but also the opposite. You can say that with dialogue, when you talk about things, there are situations and there can be problem areas where we really can develop a common understanding that we share. But there are also areas where we cannot develop a common understanding. So to this understanding of where other people are coming from, Jonathan Haidt has done a very good work. He has published a book called Why Are Good People Divided by Politics and Religion? And he argues, based on research all over the world, that we are using different moral compasses. And these moral compasses can be, for instance, care for others, do no harm. Or another compass can be fight for liberation, fight against the oppressors. Well, when you fight the oppressors, you might have to harm them. So these two moral compasses are in opposition. So non-violence and violence are also in opposition. And I can understand that there are people out there that say, because I would advocate, even in the case of Ukraine, I would advocate civil resistance. That would have saved enormous amount of human lives. It would have saved the environment. It would have reduced the number of refugees. Yes, there would be a pro-Russian puppet regime. There would be directives going out in terms of what they're going to teach in the schools. But the consequences for everyday people wouldn't be that dramatic. It's not as if they had a huge army. Hitler had 13.6 million soldiers. Russia had 200,000. You can't occupy a country with that. So dialogue does increase the respect for the other, and then it's easier to accept that we are different. And if we're going to build a democracy, the idea of democracy is that we do have different opinions about things. If I was right, and if I knew the truth, and my truth was the only truth, I should be the emperor of the world. But because we human beings are failing in our analysis, we are failing in our interests, we need a democracy so we can be corrected by others. And this commitment to democracy is a little bit what John Stuart Mill said. You cannot understand your argument before you have understood the counter arguments. So dialogue is not like a solution to things, but it makes us better equipped to tackle the challenges we meet in life on community level, in the workplace, in our families, and in states and between states.
Thank you. Dakota has a question here at Friendly House. One question.
Hello, Dr. Bryn. Thrasymachus tells Socrates in the Republic that might makes right. How do we convince our fellow citizens, and especially our young children, to value truth, small t, lowercase t, integrity, decency, and maybe courage over power and spectacle and prestige, what the Greeks called paideia?
My experience is that we need meeting grounds. We need meeting places. As long as people live segregated and their education, not only in the schools, but education from family members. I was throwing out a joke about Iowa. It's a South Dakotan joke, and there are people in Iowa that haven't even heard it, but the South Dakotans, they all know it. And we have the same between Norway and Sweden. But when you meet and when you humanize the other and you experience the value of integrated living environments, it's much harder to fight for segregation. But segregation is built on this: we take better care of our own. So for me, it's better to go to a Norwegian doctor. It's better to have a Norwegian prime minister of Norway. It's better to have a Norwegian head of the universities and the banks and so forth. But in Europe, in several countries, we are leaving the notion of Norwegian state. We have now a Pakistani president of the parliament. We have one or two potential Pakistani prime ministers of Norway. But that's going to take some change. But we learn to respect them because they are powerful, they are intelligent, they know Norway, and many of them have grown up in Norway. I have some conflicts, not conflicts, but I have some intense debates with professors I meet, and we communicate on email because they wonder if I come from a different context. In Europe, it's been a little bit back and forth throughout all these wars. You know, Napoleon lost, but now France is one of the biggest countries in Europe. And by the way, reconciliation between France and Germany is one of the most beautiful reconciliation stories. They were fighting big wars throughout the centuries, and they decided we cannot go on meeting like this. And they started enormous people-to-people, students traveling back and forth, communities, municipalities cooperating, and this had an effect. Today, Germany and France are the two strong countries. But the conflict is in the United States. The oppression of indigenous people, the oppression of Black people is such a historical continuity without any breaks. And too many white people are living without proper knowledge and proper experience about the quality of the others.
A question from Friendly House. Go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering whether you've found role playing to be a useful part of your of getting dialogue between groups, essentially having one person on one side and the other person sort of switch roles and try to act the way they believe the other side would act.
When you do this kind of work, I think there are many different styles, and you have to somehow find out what you feel comfortable with yourself as a facilitator, because also the facilitator not only has to build security in the group, but have to somehow seem secure himself. I personally do not believe in communication rules. I believe in as little directed involvement as possible. In my understanding, the perfect facilitator can leave the room and nobody notice. But in role play, you somehow introduce a technique. And personally, I prefer that people just talk from their lived experience and confront each other. So it's confrontational dialogue. It's not cozy dialogue. And there are some movies made about this. And the one movie was made in Kosovo just before the war started. And some of the people were gathered 10, 11 years later. And a new movie was made about them watching the first movie. And you can see that when you have sufficient preparation and you have also trust in the people present, you can let them talk from their own experience. And that's what I do.
We have a question from Danielle that I'll read. Why does Ukraine have to decide between nuclear war or having coffee in the morning? Why are their choices reduced to accepting defeat or nuclear catastrophe? Isn't there a third option?
Yes. So of course there is a third option. And the third option is actually Gene Sharp. He's an American nonviolent strategist. He influenced Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania in their process of breaking out of Soviet. Gene Sharp influenced Otpor, the movement in Serbia that threw down Milosevic. NATO didn't make it in 78 days of bombing, but Gene Sharp and Otpor through civil resistance. In Norway, when Quisling took power, he wanted to Nazify Norway. And he says, the teachers of Norway ruined my project, because they refused to make the students positive toward Nazi Germany. Some of them were sent in camps, some of them were killed, but Norway never surrendered. So of course, Ukraine doesn't have to be either war or coffee in the morning. But at the moment, if you ask Ukrainians, the tiredness of war is increasing. And that's my point, because sometimes in the media, you get the impression that all they want is just more weapon and go out there and be killed. I could read in Newsweek last week, Ukrainian soldiers feel they're not trained, only 1 week or 2 weeks. They don't have ammunition, they don't have weapons, and they're sent to Bakhmut to be killed.
Sometimes I think I was born in conflict.
You probably were.
My mother was from Denmark, and my father was Swedish, and they considered that a mixed marriage, and they fought all the time. If you were in my situation, how can I how can I understand either side? I have a hard time with liberals. I have a hard time with MAGA Republicans. I can't, I'm in my 80s. I don't know if I have that much left to fill in, but I really would like to understand. I'd like to help.
Well, the older you get, the less your potential for change. I was going to say that's a fact, because it's at least a fact for me. I have trouble changing. Just ask my wife. But luckily, when I fight with her, it's only when I'm right and she's wrong. I'm a smart guy. A lot of people come to me and they say, okay, so what could you have done with your dialogue if you were on the plane 9/11? What could you have done on the island in Norway where one man massacred the most people in one moment? 69 young people from the Labour Party were killed on an island of Norway in 2011. That is too late. So when we talk about change, when we talk about efficiency, we cannot evaluate after a week seminar on dialogue. We have to evaluate over time. And this is my experience. Many of the people that came to Lillehammer for 3 months, when I meet them later in life, after 10 years, 15, 20, they say, wow, now I understand what that meant. They probably didn't completely in the beginning, but then they see how things can be applied later in life. So my answer is not magic. It's just sit down and spend time and talk with these liberals and these, others you cannot understand and maybe even not respect, because there isn't another option. There isn't another alternative. And I have to admit, in my life, there are some people, dialogue doesn't change anything. We still disagree and have differences that are even brutal. So it's not a magic tool, but it's a very helpful tool.
Thank you, Steinar. Are you familiar with a movement in the United States prompted, I believe, by an organization called Listen First, bringing people of opposite persuasions together? We have our small project right here in the Humanists, trying to talk to liberals, bring liberals and conservatives together. From what you know about Listen First says they've brought together about 500 different organizations that are working for understanding. Can you get a feeling for that? And what are we going to make progress in the United States, or do we need to do more? How can we're trying to address the polarization. How are we going to do that in this country?
Again, there is no magic answer, but to take the first step, sometimes you have to take this first step without seeing all the stairs. And maybe we should start to walk the ski jump in Norway the other way around, up the steps. Because we are people with different interests, and we are somehow living in the same world. And all you can do is make your greatest effort and really, trust that you're moving in the right direction. But to trust that you are moving in the right direction, you need to check along the way. You need to check along the way by engaging in communication with the others. I think one of the most important things I have said today is that this kind of work needs preparation. I was lucky because I was full-time paid. So I could travel and recruit participants over time. If I was a volunteer or doing this on my free time, it would never been this successful. But now some of these potential leaders are leaders. For instance, the Prime Minister of Montenegro have been twice to Lillehammer, and around 30 in the Montenegrin parliament have also been to Norway. But if we had evaluated things immediately, it would not be visible on the evaluation, but an evaluation today. But everybody running, every donor, every support, they're rotating. So you have a system, and you cannot apply for projects that are more than, let's say, 1 year, 2 years, maximum 3 years. And when I come with my applications, sometimes people say, but Steinar, after 3 years, you will just come and say, we can't stop now. Well, maybe then it's better we don't start.
Thank you again for being here, and join me please in a round of applause.